Hello, my lovelies. This is Life, Love, and Linguistics, the only show on the internet that something doesn't matter. Anyway, I wanted to talk to you today about personhood and how it's constructed. What is personhood? How does one define it? Well, in this case, I mean specifically the individual constructions of both manhood and womanhood. So, what does it mean to be a man or a woman, and to whom? And if you're like me and you're more postmodern than modern, which is to say, if you feel like there may not be any objectively right way to construct personhood, is there a wrong way to do it? Short answer, yes. And today I want to specifically talk about people who construct personhood, which again, I'm meaning both manhood and womanhood all in one, very, very incorrectly. Now, if you're a clever bug, you've probably thought of at least one of the groups of people I'm going to talk about, but you may not have thought about the other. Or maybe you thought of both, in which case, clever you. You deserve a prize, but, don't spoil it for everybody, okay? So, first I want to talk a little bit about the AltRight. I know, so tired. I've been following the development of the AltRight for a long time, and although it's far from a recent occurrence, I have noticed a trend forming in the alt-right's and the far-right's understanding of history, which is to say tradition, which is to say mythology. And that's the way that the alt-right constructs their ideas of manhood. Now, real quick, because I can hear the objections forming already, I'm not saying that tradition is necessarily mythology, which you may mean to take or you may take to mean false. I'm saying that the traditions that we as a people cling to tend to come from a romanticized and mythologized past. Nobody, and I mean nobody, clings to 1950s romanticism for the alcoholism, nihilism, domestic abuse, untreated PTSD, racial segregation, and internecine violence. They cling to it for Leave It to Beaver, a television program depicting a mode of life which blatantly never occurred anywhere. This mythologized past is a critical point of reference for the alt-right and the far-right. I'm just going to say alt-right from here on. And in fact, in his video on Steve Bannon, Oliver Thorne of PhilosophyTube, and you guys should definitely watch PhilosophyTube, noted that the alt-right identifies Julius Evola as a founding thinker of their movement. Now, I'm not here to rehash the works of far better and more attractive YouTubers than myself, but just to summarize some of the points on that, Evola has a very chauvinist view of personhood, he's dead, that the only appropriate way to be a man was to be either a fighter or a thinker, and the only appropriate way to be a woman was to give yourself to a man in some capacity or another. He posits that the only way to find the right way to be a person while living in this decadent modern age is to look back into history for a reference point. But ordinary, boring, historically accurate history just won't do. No. Because as it turns out, history's messy, it's complicated, it's notably lacking in pure heroes. So what's a white boy on top of it all to do when he looks around and sees naught but degeneracy and filth, the corruption of Slaanesh, and you're not allowed to join in? You, sir, need a path out of your malaise, which everyone else is enjoying but you. And as I said before, ya boy Evola says that what you need is a reference point, which you can find in the past. In 2006, Zack Snyders released a little ditty onto the world called 300. Now at that point, the nerds among us knew about Sparta, sort of. We knew about Thermopylae. If you were really on your shit, you knew that the Persians actually won that battle, and that an alliance of Greeks, which, oh boy, that's a fraught term, defeated the Persians and halted their campaign after the Battle of Plataea a little under a year later. 300 gave men a reference point, as Evola would say, for their own manhood in the current age, and some people did not like what they saw. Now, I want to be clear here. Spartan fetishization has been a thing for a really long time. but mostly among learned people, breathing rarefied air, not touched by the unwash of the masses. 300 made it cool to be a Sparta stan. So there was a lengthy diversion here about crystal synthesis, but honestly, I'm just skip that. Basically, it was just kind of making an analogy about how bad ideas attract followers piecemeal or piecewise, and then, before you know it, you have this massive crystalline structure. And there was a very beautiful illustration of this that I was going to put in the video, but as you can see, we're doing this instead of my normal video format, which, by the way, I absolutely hate this format. But anyway, last week I saw an article published in New Republic about the rise of a phenomenon called Laconophilia. This is a fetishization of Spartan culture and society, Spartan ideas of personhood, specifically, though, manhood. Now again, I'm not going to use what little platform I have to parrot what other more capable people have already said. The article is excellent, and you should definitely read it, and it will be in the description, as well as Philosophy Tubes and everybody else we're talking about. However, fascist movements across the globe and toxic ideas of masculinity more specifically, or more generally rather, have flocked to Laconophilia as a kind of signpost for what personhood should be. Again, specifically, manhood. One prominent example that I want to point out briefly is from actual no-shit modern-day Greece. Greece's fascist neo-Nazi, fiercely anti-immigrant Golden Dawn party every single year goes to Thermopylae, which is in the middle of nowhere and has this big anti-immigrant fasci Bonnaroo. And I just want to point out how ridiculous that is. I hope I don't have to tell you that Zack Snyders' movie got a lot wrong. Blue, over at Overly Sarcastic Productions, has an excellent video about Persia, the big bad in the Battle of Thermopylae, which is a place, by the way, that you can go to today. There's a monument and everything. Link for the videos in the description. Now, you look at Thermopylae as it exists today, and questions arise. And in defense of historical accuracy, the shoreline of the Gulf of Malaya has retreated significantly from its 400 BCE boundaries. I mean, as it stands now, the Persians could have basically marched all 2 million men around any place the Spartans set up. But at the time, the pass was only about 300 feet wide. So there is that. It's also kind of creepy that there's this fetishization of a dude who lost so hard everyone under his command died in a battle that made almost no sense and was of very little significance to the war effort as a whole. But you know what? This isn't about 300. It's not even really about Thermopylae. This is about a bigger structural concern, because Thermopylae is not the only thing that the Laconophiles get wrong about Sparta. Now, as both a gender and a sexual minority, it's really hard for me to look at reality of life in Persia and the reality of life in ancient Greece and not identify more with the Persians. Hell, even in Zack Snyders' masturbatory fanfic, the only people depicted as having any fun at sex at all were the Persians. Look, there's a scene where they have an orgy. That's fun. Hey, Baphomet is there too. Cool, I guess. Sounds way more interesting than whatever the Athenians were up to be perfectly honest. The only people who even hinted at any kind of diversity of thought were the Persians, although that's not really apparent from this genuinely terrible, stupid freaking movie. Now, we in America are of the Western tradition, ostensibly, and therefore we're supposed to side with Greece because Athens and democracy and, oh right, Sparta was a diarchy. They had not one, but two kings. Anyway, as far as the sex and the thought stuff is concerned, Snyder accidentally got that part right. Persia was an administrative success because they ruled with a light touch. They demanded only tribute, they were respectful of the religions of their constituent people. Their religion was egalitarian on its face, whereas if you wanted to find any kind of equality in the Greek religion, you kind of had to do some digging. And interestingly, they didn't have slaves. So we have to talk about Spartan culture a little bit, which is actually not very easy. Now, perhaps you've heard of laconic wit. It's the ability to say something witty and clever in as few words as possible. For example, Philip II of Macedon, after having conquered Greece, said to the ephors, "Shall I come to you as a friend or a foe?" And the ephors of Sparta responded, "Neither." Philip lost his cool and responded, "You are advised to submit without delay, for if I bring my army to your land, I will burn your farms, slay your people, and raze your city." The ephors of Sparta responded with a single word, "If." Point is, these were notoriously tight-lipped people who didn't like talking about themselves and didn't have any kind of love for or trust of outsiders. So all of our surviving records of Sparta are from Athenian sources. I hope I don't have to explain why the historical swearsy-reelsies of the proto-historians of Sparta's on-again, off-again frenemy are probably not good sources. But they are what we've got. So, okay, Sophie, get back on track. What is the point of all of this? I mean, I've been rambling about historicity and historiography this whole time. Look, my point is that we have an unreliable historical record of what Spartans actually thought and how they did government or society. And from that fragment, the alt-right has crystallized this kind of ersatz manhood from it. They think that being a man means rejecting imperfect or malformed men. Side note, who decides the breadth and applicability of the word malformed is of interest to me specifically. Because I think probably the large gentleman in his basement is probably not going to make the cut. By undergoing training, intense training to be a fighter, to be willing and able to die in defense of your homes. Thermopylae is nowhere near Sparta, and the Spartan polis were unscathed by the Persians during the entire war that they lost. So these ideas are pretty toxic, but they found a kind of symmetry with the misogyny that underlies the group that would coalesce eventually into the alt-right, as well as the anti-immigrant racism of those groups, which... oh yeah, that. So if you're going to be a woman at any point in ancient history and okay, if you're sure. But if you insist on doing that to yourself, and I cannot stress enough, don't, and you are born in what we would now call Greece, you would absolutely want to be born in Sparta. Now, they were not #feminist AF, but they were a damn sight better about women's rights than Athens. Now, here we get into some points of historiographical debate. I read a few papers in the research of this essay, and it seems to be far from settled history, but it appears mostly to come from Athenian sources. But in his excellent video on Athenian observations of Spartan society, Historia Civilis makes note of a couple of things that are hilariously refutational to the far-right analysis of Sparta. So first, the Spartan government issued parcels of land and allotments of slaves and livestock to each adult male. When that male dies, because all Spartan men were landowners and soldiers, unlike in Athens where that land would go to the next male heir, in Sparta, that land would go to the deceased's wife. The inheritance would then be split evenly between her children, who would then go get married and mingle their lands with their spouses, and so on and so forth, and etc., until you have a massive social clique of war widows who were absurdly wealthy. So much so that it was in the political interest of the kings and the ephors of Sparta to keep the women happy. As much as 40% of all the landownings in Sparta belong to them. So that's a de facto matriarchy, me old son. Yeah. So the other big thing that these anti-immigrant misogynists get wrong is that Spartans considered themselves to be foreign occupiers, illegal immigrants, colonizers, slavers. In fact, that's the reason they were so oppressive to their slave caste, the Helots. They knew they were on others' land, and they knew that they were going to fall from internal strife, and it would be at the hands of the Helots, whose land they had stolen. So, to recap all that, the far right's problematic faves were both violent illegal immigrants who dominated the people whose land they invaded, and they were run behind the scenes by women. Your waifu is shit, AltRight. The New Republic article goes on at great length to dissect the myth of Spartan invincibility. They lost often and laughably. At Thermopylae, for starters, as a way of kind of examining the fallacy of alt-right constructions of the past. But there's another line of thought that intersects at Julius Evola with the alt-right reasoning, and perhaps you've heard of them. I am talking, in fact, about TERFs. Oh boy, so that was a saucy claim that turfy bullshit is Evolian in its reasoning. Is it... Let me ask you a question. How long ago was 2002? 1982? How about 1962? TERFs take their concept of radical feminism from the second wave of feminism, which crystallized in the early 60s and lasted until about the early 80s. Now, I'm no historian. Wait, shit. I mean, I'm definitely a historian, and as definitely, absolutely a historian, let me just note that the 60s through the 80s were a dark and violent time in our national history, especially for queer people or other disadvantaged minorities. And the social movements of the time tended to reflect that. The goal of the second wave was raising awareness of issues such as sexuality, workplace inequality, domestic violence, marital rape, reproductive rights. There were a lot of good things that the second wave fought for. And they also had some problematic woman in the attic types. At any time you hear a moron use the term feminazi, they're thinking of a second wave radical feminist, but they don't know that. In the radical sector, there were lesbian separatists, female supremacists, anti-sex work crusades, basically all of the crazy shit that people accuse feminists of being. That all happened in a time where everybody was going a little crazy. And as with any social movement that raises the temperature in the discourse, there were several grift-slurping hucksters waiting in the wings to make a living off of it. And many of these shitbags are still alive. The truly evil ones live forever. Anyway, much of the second wave of feminism, and no small part of the radical branch of it, were accepting and supportive of trans women. But there were a few academics that started toying with some phraseology that if you're trans, you've probably heard before. And if you're trans, I'll hold up my finger like this when we're done talking about this and you can just skip ahead. Things like colonizing female spaces and woman with a Y. Here, academics like Sheila Jeffries and Janice Raymond. If you don't get that joke, find a Jew and ask them to explain it to you. People who say things like trans women are a necrophilic invasion of women's spaces, and that the problem of transgenderism is best served by morally mandating it out of existence. So, let me just say that these bitches are gross, and I'm not going to quote any more of them because it's as upsetting to me as it is to you. So, the second wave ended in the early 90s after the hilariously titled porn wars were lost by the radical feminists, and the rest of the second wave just didn't really care that much. Thus began the third wave, with more liberated views on things like the role of trans women in lesbian spaces and culture, and also intersectionality, which, if you're a conservative and you're watching this and you've made it this far. First off, I'm impressed. Get yourself a cookie. You've earned it. But also, intersectionality doesn't mean what you think it means. It's just understanding the similarities between the struggles that different demographic groups go through, and it advocates pooling resources and working together to ameliorate these struggles. The TERFs, though, are still around, mostly sequestered to their academic institutions. Raymond, still works at UMass Amherst, last I heard. She's like a cockroach. She'll bury us all, because again, the evil ones last forever. Point is, they're done. They're not a force in modern feminism, and haven't been for nearly 30 years. Which provides just enough daylight for a certain segment of regressive reactionaries to take up the mantle of radical feminism by looking back to a mythologized Evolian past, peering through the fog of war that surrounds that era, seeing a mythologized pillar of the community in idiots like, I'm so sorry, trans women, Sheila, trans women aren't women because they'll never have a stinky vagina Jeffries, and that's the last one of those, I swear. And seeing a reference point by which they can define womanhood. There's a definition that works. In this specific way that is dumb on purpose, just because the wisdom of the past allows them to be mean to people in the present, and they can say, look, don't blame me. It's not my fault. Take it up with Jeffries. And this is done by relatively few honest people. Some of them are political lesbians and hateful right-wingers who are looking for a majority coalition in a world that's in the process of leaving them behind. TERFs, your waifu is shit, and dumb shit to boot. So I want to talk for a second about generalizing the trend here, because there's a flaw in their logic that is just, to me, Ask any TERF or any Sparta-standing Evolus superfan what they think of trans people, or postmodern philosophy. Or don't, because they're terrible people and we shouldn't interact with them ever, or ever acknowledge their existence. But I'm willing to bet my reputation on the notion that they'll tell you they're not a fan of either. The guys who do what Spartans do, just because that's the ideal of manhood, to fight and die for the honor and country, or the people who do what 70s lesbian separatists, quite a lot of whom, by the way, were married to men, do, because the definition of womanhood is there. That's what women do. They bleed and birth. And God, that sounds an awful lot like Davis Arini. In her wrongly maligned video Aesthetics, Contrapoints talks a bit about Judith Butler. I went and read some Butler in preparation for this video. I am so tired, and I tried to find some quotes here, because this whole thing that they do, where they act like Spartans despite being 0.00% Greek, or they act like 70s era lesbian rad femmes despite having no intention of having a polyamorous lesbian commune somewhere. I feel like there's a word for that. A word that they would hate. When we say that personhood is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role or we're acting in some way, and that our role playing is crucial to the personhood that we are and the personhood that we present to the world. So that's a quote from Judith Butler, who is a postmodern philosopher. We just described both the TERFs and the Sparta stands, and I just changed gender to personhood in that quote, so we also described trans people with postmodern philosophy. There's a fundamental hypocrisy in the far-right Sparta stands and the TERFs ideology. Shocking, I know. But the problem is that at the end of the day, they don't care that they're being hypocrites. They're not shocked by any of this either. They're fine with it. It's not new. Jean-Paul Sartre hinted at this in the 60s in his essay Anti-Semite and the Jew, which I swear the right read and was like, Yes, but hear me out. What if we unironically act like this? So, a quote from that work. The anti-Semite has chosen hate because hate is a faith. At the outset, he has chosen to devaluate words and reasons. How entirely at ease he feels as a result. How futile and frivolous discussions about the right of the Jew appear to him. He has placed himself on an other ground from the beginning. If out of courtesy he consents for a moment to defend his point, he lends himself, but does not give himself. He tries simply to project his intuitive certainty onto the plane of discourse. And then a more famous part of that, never believe that anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. The anti-Semites have the right to play. So I guess what I'm saying here is specifically to British media outlets, but also to anyone who considers talking to them, and the message is this. Stop humoring these idiots, because they're idiots. They know they're idiots. They don't care that they're idiots. And they'll use your thoughtful nature against you. If you feel that you need to address their very stupid ideas, talk around these individuals, ignore them aggressively, suck all the conversational oxygen out of the room. It's the only way to unfuck the media environment that we have now. Their ideas are not worth consideration. So I guess if I had to break it down to one simple phrase, it'd be this. Molon lave these nuts, idiots. Anyway, that's all I have for this week. I don't like this format at all. I really cannot wait to be back to the old format. And again, I'm really sorry that's what ended up happening. Pardon me. And I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons on Patreon, and a big special thank you to Peng Peng Chong, who provided me with the laptop that I'm now using, since my old laptop, the one with the editing software on it, borked it. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys next week. Love you guys.